A mail-order bride arrived with twins she had never mentioned in any of her letters. The stagecoach was 40 minutes late, which gave me time to stand in the sun outside Farron's Dry Goods and reconsider every decision I had ever made in my life. Not all of them, just the one that had me standing there with my hat in my hands and a $2 haircut I'd paid for that morning, waiting on a woman I'd never laid eyes on. Her name was Clara Voss. She was 29, widowed out of St. Joseph, Missouri, and she wrote a clean, direct letter, no flowery nonsense. She'd said she was capable, that she'd worked a farm her whole life, that she wanted a fresh start in a place where she wasn't known, and that she was willing to work for what she got. 3 letters back and forth. The third one was mine, asking her to come west if she was of a mind to. She said yes. I'm Harlan Briggs. I run 160 acres of short grass pasture about 11 miles southeast of Caldwell, Kansas, in the years just after the trail drives thinned out. I've got cattle, a few horses, a well that mostly works, and a house built from cottonwood frame and sod and later on some proper lumber for the front room. I was 46 years old that day at the stage office. I'd been married once to a woman named Ruth, who died of a fever 8 years prior. We never had children, which was a grief she felt more than me, and which I still carry in a way I don't have language for. I wasn't soft about the whole mail-order business. I wasn't romantic about it either. I needed a woman who could keep a house and keep herself and be a decent partner to a quiet man on a working ranch. If something warmer grew from that in time, that was fine. If it didn't, that was the deal we'd struck, and I intended to honor it. So there I stood, hat in hands, $2 haircut getting damp in the August heat. The stage came in from the east trailing its dust cloud, the driver already leaning on the brake before it fully stopped, and I watched the door open and the step drop and a woman climb down. She was slight, dark hair pinned up under a brown travel bonnet. Her dress was road gray from the dust. She had a tapestry bag on one arm, and with her other hand she reached back up into the coach and said something I couldn't hear, and then a boy climbed down. Maybe a year and a half old, 2 at the outside. Sturdy little thing, bare feet already hitting the ground and looking around at everything with his eyes wide. Then she reached up again, and the driver passed down a second child. Same age, same face, different hat, or rather no hat, where the first one had a little cloth cap. Twins, 2 boys not quite 2 years old, holding each other's hands in the dirt of the Caldwell Stage Depot while their mother turned and looked across the yard and found me standing there with my mouth not quite shut. I don't know what my face did, I know what it felt. She walked toward me. The boys came with her, the one on the left dragging slightly, still interested in the wheel of the stage. Her chin was up. Her eyes were straight on mine, and they didn't flinch and they didn't ask. They braced. She stopped 3 feet from me and said, "Mr. Briggs, I am Clara Voss. I apologize for the late hour. I know this is not what you expected, and I understand entirely if you need to make a different arrangement. I have enough fare to get back as far as Wichita." The boys looked up at me. I looked down at them. I put my hat back on my head. I said, "You need help with that bag." She didn't say anything for a moment. Then, "I can manage it." "I've got a buckboard," I said. "It's around the corner, not far to walk." I picked up the bag anyway, which she allowed, and we walked. The boy with the cap held his mother's hand. The other one, the one without a hat, walked about 2 feet from me on my left side and studied the ground as he went, which I thought was a reasonable approach to a new place. I got them all into the buckboard. Clara sat in the bench seat, and I handed the boys up to her, and they settled in against her sides, and she held them with an arm each. I climbed up and took the reins. We drove out of Caldwell in the late afternoon, and neither of us said anything for the first half mile. Then she said, "I was afraid if I told you, you wouldn't want us to come." I kept my eyes on the road. "How old are they?" 20 months, Jeb, that's Jeb with the cap, and Cal. Jeb and Cal, I looked at them over my shoulder. They were watching the landscape going by with the same focused attention most men give a poker hand. "Their father," I said, "died of a burst appendix 14 months ago, before they were a year old." I thought about that. A man dead at what, 30? Leaving a woman with 2 infants not yet walking. I didn't say anything about it. She said, "I have money saved. Not much. Enough to board somewhere while I find work if that's what you decide. I don't expect you to." "Clara." She stopped. "I asked you to come out," I said. You're here, we'll figure the rest. I felt her look at me from the side. I didn't turn toward it. The road needed watching. The house, when we got to it, was what it was. I'd cleaned it, which wasn't something I was accustomed to doing at any particular level of thoroughness. I'd put a curtain up in the back room, which I'd intended as her room, and I'd built a second sleeping shelf above the narrow bed there for storage, not knowing there'd be 2 children who might want it. I stood in the doorway of that back room and looked at the single bed and the 2 boys looking up at the sleeping shelf. She stood beside me and looked at the same things. I'll build something better, I said. For them, give me a few days. Mr. Briggs. Harland. She paused, then, Harlan, you don't have to do that. I looked at the boys. Cal had already gone to the shelf and was testing it with his hands, bouncing his weight against it to see what it did. Jeb was looking at the window. It'll be a week, I said. Maybe less. Can they sleep in there together for now? They always have, she said. So that was that. I made supper, salt pork and beans and cornbread, which was about the extent of what I kept on hand, and we ate at the table, the boys on a crate I'd hauled in and turned upside down to get them to the right height. They ate with their hands mostly, which was fine. Cal kept watching me from across the table with a level expression that reminded me of a man sizing up what he'd gotten himself into. I didn't mind that. I'd have felt the same. After supper, Clara put them to bed. I sat on the porch and smoked and listened to her in there, her voice low and steady, some kind of song I didn't know, 2 or 3 verses of it until they settled. The night was clear and the grasshoppers were going in the pasture, and a coyote somewhere east started in and then stopped. She came out and stood in the doorway. They're down. Good. She stood there a moment. Then she came and sat in the other chair, the one I'd brought out from the kitchen 2 years ago and never brought back in, and she folded her hands in her lap. I owe you an honest explanation, she said. You don't owe me anything, I said. You told me why. I was afraid you'd say no. I might have, I let that sit there, but I didn't. The coyote started up again, closer this time. She listened to it. Are you angry? She asked. I thought about whether I was. I'd been surprised. Surprise isn't the same thing as angry. No, I said. You're quiet. I'm always quiet. She made a sound that might have been the beginning of a small laugh, and then thought better of it. I finished the smoke and put it out against the porch rail. I'll sleep in the barn tonight, give you and the boys the house. You don't have to. I know I don't have to. I got up and she watched me go, and I was halfway to the barn before she said, behind me, Harlan. I stopped. Thank you, she said. I didn't say anything back. I went to the barn and made a place in the hay and lay there listening to the horses breathe until I fell asleep. 3 things I had not accounted for in making this arrangement. The first was how much noise 2 20-month-old boys could generate before the sun cleared the horizon. I woke up in the barn at first light to something that sounded like a sustained crisis, which turned out to be Cal screaming because Jeb had taken his cornbread from supper that he'd apparently been saving under his pillow, which was a strategy I had some respect for even while the noise of it rattled the barn walls. The second was how fast they moved. By the time I'd gotten my boots on and come across the yard, one of them was already at the well, and the other one was headed for the chicken coop. I spent the first 10 minutes of that day in pure logistics, which was a thing I hadn't done in 8 years, not since Ruth, and which used muscles you don't know you have. The third was Clara at work. I didn't know what I'd been expecting. Something adequate, I suppose. What I got was a woman who by 7 in the morning had the house swept, the beds made, the breakfast going, the boys fed and relocated to the yard with a rope tied across the gate of the small pen where I kept a few chickens. Not to pen the chickens, but to give the boys a boundary they'd respect. And she herself was standing at the stove with her hair done up and her sleeves rolled, and she looked like she'd been there 10 years. I stood in the door. She handed me a plate. There's coffee. I sat down, I ate. She ate standing at the counter because the boys were outside, and she kept an eye on them through the window. I said, you've done this before. Farmed my whole life, my father's place, then my husband's. No, I said, this, running a place with no warning and no fuss. She looked at me. What other way is there to do it? I didn't have an answer for that. I drank my coffee and watched her and thought, whoever that man was who died in Missouri, he didn't deserve her. Most men don't. The first week was work. I built the boys a proper sleeping area in the back room, a low, wide shelf built into the corner, slatted sides so they couldn't roll out, with a rope ladder because Cal had already demonstrated he was a climber. I padded it with blankets. It took me 3 evenings, working by lamplight. Clara brought coffee when I was at it, and once handed me a nail I'd dropped without me asking her to. She ran the house. I ran the ranch. We ate together in the mornings and evenings. She kept the boys from killing themselves or each other, which I came to understand was about a half-time job in itself. At the end of the week, she asked me where I kept the ledger. I got it out for her. She looked it over. "You're short on winter feed," she said. "I know it. And your south fence needs repair. I saw it from the road yesterday." I looked at her. "I walked it," she said. "Just the south stretch, maybe a quarter mile. There are 3 posts that have rotted out." Ruth never walked fence. Ruth would never have thought to. I didn't say that. "I'm fixing it Saturday," I said. "I can help." "You don't need to help with fence." "I didn't say I needed to," she said. "I said I could." Saturday I fixed fence. She came with me. She carried posts on her shoulder without comment, and she held the wire while I stapled it, and she didn't talk while we worked, which was the right instinct. Jeb and Cal sat in the back of the buckboard with a flour sack full of cornmeal crackers and were more or less content for 2 hours, which I gathered was a record. On the way back I said, "You're not what I expected." "What did you expect?" "A woman looking to be provided for." She thought about that. "I'm looking to provide same as you, just not the same things." I thought about what she meant. I thought I understood it. The first hard thing came at the end of the second week. Neighbor of mine, Dale Purvis, came by on a Thursday morning. Dale was the kind of man who meant well and never quite managed it, running about 400 acres north of me with a wife and a batch of half-grown kids. Good man, essentially, not always smart about what came out of his mouth. He came to borrow a trace chain which I had, and I walked with him to the barn to get it. Clara was in the yard with the boys. Dale saw her. He tipped his hat. He looked at the boys. He looked at me. "May lord or woman," he said low, not unkind, more curious. "That's Clara," I said. "She's my wife," which wasn't quite accurate yet, legally speaking, but I said it anyway. "Boys are hers." "They're ours," I said. He looked at me again. Something in his face tried to ask a question. "The trace chain's on the second peg," I said. He got the chain. He didn't say anything else about it. But I knew by Saturday it would be all over the south end of the county. Harlan Briggs's May lord or woman had come with 2 children, and I knew what that county would make of it, which was exactly what they made of everything they didn't fully understand, which was a mess of opinions nobody asked for. That evening I sat down at the table with Clara and told her what I'd said. She went still. "I called you my wife," I said. "I shouldn't have done that without asking you. I'm asking now." She looked at the boys. They were asleep already. She looked back at me. "You claimed them," she said. "I claimed all 3 of you." "Why?" I thought about how to answer that honestly. "Because nobody in this county gets to look at you sideways," I said, "or them." She was quiet for a long time. The lamp was between us on the table, and she looked at her hands, and I waited. "In St. Joseph," she said finally, after Daniel died. "People were kind mostly, but there were looks. You know the looks. A widow woman with 2 babies and not enough money and no man to stand for her. I know those looks very well." "I know them too," I said. "I've seen them given." "I don't want that for my boys." "They won't get it," I said. "Not here." She looked up at me. It wasn't soft, the look. It was searching, trying to find out if I meant it or if I was just saying words. I held her eyes because there was nothing to hide. "You'd have to marry me for real," she said. "I know it." "I can't give you children," she said. "I don't know if I can or not, truthfully, but I'm 29 and I've been worn hard and I'm not. I don't think you should count on it." "I'm 46, I said. I wasn't counting on much." "The boys." "The boys are part of the deal," I said. "Same as they've been since the stage pulled in." She looked at her hands again. Outside somewhere, the wind had come up and the front door was rattling against the latch. "All right," she said. I got up and fixed the door. We were married by the county judge in Caldwell 3 weeks later. It was a Wednesday in the afternoon. The judge's wife was the witness. Jeb sat on Clara's hip for most of it, and Cal ran up and down the steps of the courthouse until I picked him up, which he accepted the way a small animal accepts being held, not fighting it, but making it plain it was a temporary arrangement. On the way home, Clara rode with Cal in her lap and Jeb beside her, and she said, "You didn't have to do any of this, you know." "I did, though," I said. "You didn't. You could have put us on the next stage east." "I could have," I said. "I wasn't going to." She watched the road for a while. "Why not?" she said. I thought about it. I'd thought about it a lot, actually, over the past weeks. Not with any heavy sense of weighing, just the way a man thinks over a decision he already knows he's made. "You came out here with nothing," I said. "2 children and a bag and enough fare to get to Wichita. And you walked off that stage with your chin up. You were ready to hear bad news, and you were already planning what you'd do about it." She didn't say anything. "A woman like that deserves a man who'll stand up," I said. It came out plainer than I meant it. I didn't take it back. She looked at me for a moment. Then she looked at the road ahead, and I felt something settle between us, like a knot pulled through and tightened, and neither of us said anything else the rest of the way home. October. The grasshoppers were gone, and the mornings had gone from cool to cold, and I'd brought the cattle in from the south pasture. The boys had learned my name, not father, not pa, just Harlan, which was fine, that was honest. And Cal had taken a particular interest in the horses, which meant I spent a portion of most mornings keeping him out of the corral. Clara had the garden put to bed for winter and had started laying up preserves. The house smelled different, not unpleasant, just different from what I'd been used to. Salt pork and dust and saddle oil had given way to something that included wood smoke and bread, and occasionally whatever she was doing with apples from the 2 trees behind the barn. I came in one afternoon from mending the stock tank, and she had biscuits on, and the boys were at the table each with a small piece of dough. They'd been given to keep them occupied. And Jeb had made his into a lump that might have been a horse or a rock, and Cal had eaten half of his. I washed up at the basin and dried my hands, and she turned from the stove and looked at me, and I said, "What?" "Nothing," she said. "You just came in looking like November." "It's October." "I know when it is." She turned back to the stove. "Sit down, it'll be ready." I sat. Cal showed me the half piece of dough he'd saved. I told him good work. Jeb held up his horse rock. I told him it was a good horse. He seemed satisfied. We ate. Afterward, Clara put the boys down and came back out and poured herself a cup of coffee and sat across from me, and I had the sense she had something to say. "Dale Purvis's wife came by today," she said. I waited. She brought a pie. "Marge is a good woman," I said. She asked about the boys, where they came from, who their father was. I looked at her. I told her Daniel Voss was their father and he died in Missouri and they're Briggs boys now, she said. She seemed satisfied with that. "Good." She also said, Clara set her cup down. She said you had a reputation for being closed off, that people in the county had sort of given up trying to be neighborly with you. "That's accurate," I said. She seemed surprised you'd taken us in. "I didn't take you in," I said. "I married you." She looked at me steadily. She said, and she meant it kindly, I think, she said whatever you'd done, it had changed you, that you looked different this fall than she'd ever seen you. I didn't say anything to that. Clara picked up her cup again. "I just thought you should know someone noticed." I sat with that a while. Outside, the wind had come back and it pushed at the house with a cold shoulder, and I could hear the horses moving in the barn, that low, steady shuffling they do when they're easy and warm. What I felt wasn't easy to name, something between being seen and being steadied. The way a fence holds better after it's been walked and the weak posts replaced, not because it's new, but because somebody went out there and put in the work. I said, "They notice because of you." "That's not true." "It is," I said. "You came off that stage ready to do whatever needed doing. That kind of thing doesn't go unnoticed, not to me." She looked at her hands. I was terrified. "I know. I thought for sure you'd send us back." "I thought about it," I said, honest, "for about 10 seconds. She looked up at me. Then Cal went for the well and Jeb headed for the chickens, and there wasn't time to think about anything else, I said. She laughed, An actual laugh, the first real one I'd heard from her, low and sudden and with some relief in it, and it changed the whole room for a minute, that sound. The snow came hard in November. I'd seen it come hard before, but the second week of November brought 3 days of it, the kind that stacks on the fence rails and closes the road, and makes the barn feel like the only solid thing in the world. I kept the cattle fed, and Clara kept the house, and the boys dealt with the novelty of snow the way boys do, which is to say they wanted to be in it constantly and were furious at being brought back inside. On the third day of the storm, I came in from the barn at midday and stamped the snow off my boots and came into the kitchen, and Clara was at the table with the boys, all 3 of them on the same side, and she'd taken a piece of flour sack and was drawing on it with a burned stick, a cow, or something like one, and Cal was pointing at it and saying a word that might have been cow or might have been something else, and Jeb was very carefully holding another piece of sack and waiting his turn. I stood in the doorway and took that in. She looked up. I said, "Don't stop." She looked at me for a moment, and then she looked back at the boys and kept drawing, and I took off my coat and hung it and came and sat at the other end of the table and watched the 3 of them. Jeb got his turn and was very serious about whatever he was drawing, which turned out to be nothing identifiable, but which Clara praised with complete sincerity. After a while, Cal slid off the bench and came around the table and stood next to me. He looked at the drawings. He looked at me. Then he put his hand on my knee, just for a moment the way a child does when they're satisfied with what's in front of them, not asking for anything, just marking that he was there and so was I, and that was all right. I put my hand on top of his for a second, then he wandered off. Clara was watching me from across the table. "He does that," she said. "Does what?" "Checks on people, makes sure they're still there." I looked at the doorway Cal had gone through. "His father's gone," I said. "Yes." I thought about that little hand on my knee, the weight of it. 11 months old when his father died. Not old enough to remember anything except maybe the fact of an absence, the shape of something that should be there and isn't. I got up and filled the kettle and put it on and didn't say anything else about it. But something had gotten into my chest that I couldn't shake, and I didn't try. Christmas. I'm not a religious man in any organized sense. Ruth had been, and I'd gone with her when she was alive, but since then I'd let it go the way you let things go when the reason for them is gone. Clara wasn't especially observant either, but she made a good case for the holiday on the grounds that the boys were now old enough to know what it was and to have opinions about it. We cut a small cedar from the back of the south pasture. I have no idea why that seemed like the right thing to do, but it did, and the boys thought it was extraordinary, which vindicated the decision. We put it in the front room, and Clara strung it with bits of ribbon and a few small tin ornaments she had in the bottom of her bag, and the boys stood in front of it for about 20 minutes doing nothing but looking. I made them boots for Christmas. Small ones, leather, properly lasted. I'd been working on them in the evenings after they were in bed, and I had to measure their feet without them knowing it, which Clara had helped me with, lifting each sleeping boy's foot and pressing it against a piece of paper while I marked the outline. She'd done it without waking either of them, which required the steadiness of a surgeon. Christmas morning, I brought the boots out. Cal tried his on immediately and walked the length of the room and back, and looked at me with an expression so serious it might have been a man accepting a land deed. Jeb sat down and put his on one at a time, very carefully, and then stood up and walked to his mother and showed her his feet. She looked at the boots and then she looked at me, and what was in her face wasn't anything I can put to plain words. It wasn't surprise. It was more like something had confirmed itself. She said, "Harlan." That was all, just my name. I said, "They'll need new ones by spring. Feet grow." "I know they do." She was still looking at me. I said, "Maybe by spring they'll want to help with chores. Something real, Cal especially. He'll want to go to the barn." "He can come to the barn," I said. She came across the room then, the boys still watching their own feet, and she put both her hands on my face, the way a person does when they want to make sure you're looking right at them and not at something else, and she did that for a moment, and I let her. Then she said, quiet, "You're a good man, Harlan Briggs." I started to say I wasn't, or that I'd only done what needed doing, or some other thing that was more or less true but also beside the point. I didn't say any of it. Instead, I put my hands over hers and held them there for a second. Then Cal fell off a chair. He wasn't hurt, he was perfectly fine. He stood back up with a dignified expression and went right back to looking at the tree. But it broke the moment, and we both laughed, and that was all right. That was the right way for it to go. February. The cold that month was the kind that gets into the walls of a house and lives there. I kept the fires going and the cattle alive and the well from freezing with a bale of straw over the pump cover. And by the third week of it, I was tired in my bones in a way I hadn't been in some years. On a Thursday evening, I came in and sat down at the table and didn't get back up. Clara looked at me. She put a cup of coffee in front of me. She looked at me again. "What hurts?" she said. "Nothing," I said. "Harland." I didn't want to get into it. But she stood there and waited, and after a while I said, "My back, nothing serious, just war." She went and got something from the shelf, a small tin I hadn't noticed before. Liniment. She'd had it in her kit. She said, "Take your shirt off." "Clara, just your shirt." I did. She stood behind me at the table and worked that liniment into the muscles on either side of my spine with her hands. And she didn't do it gently, which was the right call. You don't help a man's back by being delicate about it. And she worked her way up and across my shoulders, and I sat there and let her. I hadn't been touched like that in 8 years. Not in grief, not with any particular weight to it. Just the fact of another person's hands, steady and sure, working at something that hurt and slowly making it less. After a while I said, "You didn't have to do that." "I know it," she said, which was what I'd said to her that first night about sleeping in the barn. I turned to look at her. She was close, her hands still on my shoulders. She wasn't performing anything. She wasn't waiting to see what I'd do. She was just there, and she looked at me the way I'd looked at her fence work and her kitchen and her boys in their Christmas boots, like something that had turned out to be more than she'd counted on and that she didn't intend to take lightly. I said, "Clara." She said, "I know." And that was the shape of it. That was what it was between us. Spring. The mud came first, and then the green, and then one morning I woke up and the meadowlarks were back in the south pasture, and the air had that smell, rain, and new grass, and the particular warmth that tells you the worst is over. Cal and I were at the barn by sunup most mornings. He was 2.5 now, sturdy and opinionated, and he had decided that the bay gelding named Frank was his particular concern. He couldn't brush Frank. He could barely reach Frank's belly, but he stood by and watched me do it with the seriousness of a foreman making sure the work was right. I handed him the brush one morning and showed him how. He worked at it for about 5 minutes. His strokes were short and uneven, and Frank, to his great credit, stood absolutely still. Then Cal stopped and looked up at me and said, "Good." "Good," I said. He handed the brush back, business concluded. I've thought about that moment more than makes sense, probably. A 2.5-year-old asking if he'd done his work right, the wanting to do it right, the asking. I know what it is. I know why it matters. I'm not going to say it plain because that's not how these things work. You don't say them plain, you just carry them. April. Dale Purvis stopped by to return the trace chain and stayed for dinner. His wife had come with him. They sat at my table and ate Clara's cooking and watched the boys do what they did, which was take turns being loud and being quiet and occasionally knocking things over. After dinner, Dale and I sat on the porch. He said, "You look different than you did last summer." "Different how?" I said. He thought about it. "Like a man who's got something to do," he said. I smoked and didn't say anything. "I mean that well," he said. "I know you do." The sun was going down behind the line of cottonwoods along the creek, and the light came through in long pieces, and from inside the house I could hear Clara and Marge and the boys and the particular shape of that noise. A household, actual and inhabited. I said, "She's a good woman." "I can see that," Dale said. "Came out here with 2 babies and no guarantees. Walked off that stage ready to turn right back around if she had to." I paused. "She didn't have to." Dale was quiet. "Those boys," I said. I stopped. "They're good boys." Dale nodded. I finished the smoke. Inside, one of the boys laughed, Cal, I could tell them apart by now, and Marge said something and Clara said something back, and then they both laughed. I said I was about done before she came, not dramatic about it, just running out of reasons. Dale looked at me. "She fixed that," I said, "all 3 of them." He didn't say anything sentimental. He was a good enough man not to. He just nodded once, and that was fine. Late April, a Sunday. I'd been out early checking the cattle, came back in by mid-morning. The boys were in the yard with a length of rope and some plan between them that seemed to involve the fence post and a level of ambition I respected. Clara was on the porch with her coffee. I came up the steps, and she handed me her cup without being asked, and I drank from it and handed it back, and she took it like we'd been doing that for 20 years. She said, "Jeb asked me last night if you were his pa." I looked at the boys in the yard. "What did you tell him?" I said. "I told him to ask you." I thought about that. I thought about him lying in the dark with that question at 2.5 years old, working it around. I went back down the steps and across the yard, and I crouched down in front of Jeb, who stopped what he was doing and looked at me with those eyes that were his father's, whoever that man had been. I said, "Your mama says you got a question for me." He looked at me, then he looked at Cal, who had come over and was watching. Then he looked back at me. "Are you my pa?" he said. I looked at him. I thought about the right word for it, the one that was true and was also earned. "I'm the one who's here," I said. He thought about that. Then he said, "Okay," and went back to the rope. Cal, who had been listening, came and put his hand on my knee again, same as that afternoon in the snow. And I put my hand over it, and we held that for a second, and then he went back to the rope, too. I stood up. Clara was watching from the porch. She had both hands around her cup, and she was looking at me the way she had at Christmas, that look I couldn't quite name, the one that was a kind of confirmation. I went back up the steps. She said, "You know they'll call you Pa." "I know it," I said. She reached out with one hand and held my arm for a moment. Not pulling, not holding on, just resting her hand there, sure and quiet, the way a person does when they want to mark that they see you. Then she let go, and I sat in the chair, and we watched the boys figure out whatever they were figuring out with that rope. The meadowlarks were going in the south pasture. The creek was up with snowmelt, and I could hear it from where I sat. The house was behind us, and the land was in front of us, and all of it was ours. I didn't need it to be more than that. It was the most I'd had in years.